Well, hello, and thanks for tuning in to Release podcast series. I'm Neil Andrews, editor of Relief. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak today with Bill Schmidt. Bill is president of North Star Consulting in Davis, California, which provides advice to companies working to develop new treatments for acute and chronic pain. He is also part-time vice president of clinical and regulatory for Incise Bioscience in San Diego, for Centrexion Corporation in Baltimore, and for Icosis, also in Davis, California. These are all companies involved in pain drug development. Bill has also been deeply involved in pain drug development and clinical research throughout his career, having previously worked at a number of biotech and pharma companies, and he's an internationally recognized expert on pain research and treatment. Bill joins us today to discuss pain drug development. Bill, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you, Neil. I really appreciate having a chance to talk to you and to all the people who are listening to the podcast and discussing some of the things that I think is really important about what's going on in the field of developing new pharmaceuticals or even non-pharmaceutical treatments for the treatment of acute and chronic pain.
Great. So let's start, if you would, by looking a little bit back at recent history, let's say maybe the last 20 or 25 years. How has the pain field been doing in terms of developing new, safe, and effective treatments for chronic pain?
I have to say that progress has been slow, but part of this is bureaucratic. Part of it is that 25 years ago, we didn't have the same insights in molecular medicine that we have today. And as a result, I think that the potential for progress in the next 5 to 10 years is even brighter than it has been in the past. When I started in this field, it was largely dominated by opioids and aspirin, meaning that we had morphine and morphine-like products, including oxycodone and hydrocodone, and we had Demerol, we had Tylenol number 3. All of these contained opioids, sometimes in combination with either aspirin or with acetaminophen. And then we had the aspirin class of drugs. We had aspirin itself, which is well over 100 years old, and we had more recent compounds such as ibuprofen and naproxen, and well, there are actually about 30 NSAID compounds or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that have been developed over the last 50 or 60 years. But only half of them remained on the market after they were approved, in part because as we began to use them more widely in larger populations of patients, we also began to discover that they weren't quite as safe as what we thought before. I think that everybody listening to this podcast probably remembers the enthusiasm going back to when Celebrex was introduced to the market in December of 1998. Celebrex, or celecoxib, is also an NSAID drug, but it worked in a different way than typical aspirin-like drugs. It inhibited the COX-2 receptor or enzyme, and by doing that, it was promoted as having better safety on the gastrointestinal tract than aspirin. We know that aspirin and ibuprofen and naproxen can cause gastrointestinal bleeding, particularly when they're used longer term and in higher doses that are used to treat osteoarthritis. But not too long after Celebrex was introduced, Vioxx came on the market as well. It seemed to be working the same as Celebrex. It inhibited the COX-2 enzyme, but in 2004, I think most people will remember that Vioxx was removed from the market because we also learned that it had significant cardiovascular safety risks. It caused an increase in the number of heart attacks and strokes in patients who were taking it long term. So what happened after that was that the FDA said that there would be no new NSAID approved in the United States without doing large-scale cardiovascular safety studies, or as we call them, cardiovascular outcome studies. That means that prior to drug approval, the company sponsoring a new drug would have to test this in anywhere from 20 to 30,000 patients over a period of 2 to 3 years to see whether they were as safe as drugs that were already on the market. And if they were not, they wouldn't be approved. But with that large number of patients that would be required and the huge cost, over $100 million just to do a cardiovascular outcome study, it really shut down innovation, at least with that class of drugs. But what I'm happy to say is that while many big pharma companies got out of the analgesic area at that time, smaller biotech companies came in, they looked for new targets, and there has been a lot of innovation that's gone on in developing new drugs, hitting new enzymes, new receptors, or working in ways differently than drugs have worked in the past. The other big development in the analgesic field has been in developing abuse-resistant opioids to replace the Vicodins, Percocets, Percodans, and oxycodone containing products such as OxyContin that we know have been abused in the past. Abuse-resistant products would be more difficult to tamper with if you tried to use them in some way other than their intended oral use. So Neil, that's, you know, in a nutshell, it says progress has been slow, but I'm optimistic about progress for the future.
Great. So just one question, when you look at something like Vioxx, you know, there's a difference between, of course, looking at efficacy, whether a compound actually relieves pain versus the side effects. And some researchers have said to me that recently the pain field actually in some ways has done quite well with certain compounds in terms of getting pain relief. It's just that the side effects were hard to predict. And I'm wondering, if that's the case, why has it been harder to predict side effects versus pain relief, whether, you know, you're looking at something like Vioxx or some new compounds in development like nerve growth factor?
Sometimes there are things that go on in clinical trials that are unanticipated from the preclinical record. Or in some cases, they are relatively rare side effects that may not become apparent until you teach or until you treat a large number of subjects. With Vioxx, it was argued by the company involved that they could not have predicted the increase in cardiovascular risk based upon animal studies. Whether you believe that or not, it really did take several years for that product to be on the market before it became apparent to most people that the compound caused an increase in heart attacks and strokes. There were some early warning signs though, and you know, the good news here is that there are a lot of people who have access to data who look at it very carefully, and if there is a warning sign, they're going to say something about it. There's just not any tolerance for trying to cover up side effects. I personally, when I do a clinical trial, I read every single patient record and I look for any trend in a change toward something that is just a little bit off from what I would expect that could indicate a potential for a side effect that could be problematic for the future. And if there is a warning about that, I try to find out if there's something different about that patient or something about the other drugs that the patients take. You mentioned nerve growth factor, and that has been one of the bright but clouded developments in the field during the last, well, 10 years or so. Companies that began to look at nerve growth factor as a target for pain development developed antibodies that were highly selective for binding to nerve growth factor and inactivating it. Now, you know, obviously the name nerve growth factor suggests that at some time in development it was important in guiding nerves from one target to another target, and certainly that's important in the developing embryo. It may also be important to some extent in adults, but it also is important in pain. And what was found was that by administering inhibitors or antibodies to nerve growth factor, given by injection once every 2 months, in animals as well as in humans, there could be substantial reductions in inflammatory pain or other types of pain. And I saw some results in a number of chronic pain conditions, including osteoarthritis and low back pain, that appeared to be stronger reductions in pain than I had seen really with many other classes of drugs. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. A lot of big pharma companies got involved after really it was a small company that did the innovative work out in the biotech capital of the world in South San Francisco. But then that was taken on by Merck and by Pfizer and by Amgen and by Johnson & Johnson and other companies that developed large-scale clinical trials. And what happened a few years ago in a phase 3 clinical trial, which is the most advanced stage before a drug is submitted to the FDA for approval, it was discovered that in patients who were taking one of the nerve growth factors, there appeared to be an increase in the number of patients requiring joint replacement surgery because their joints failed. And that was completely unexpected from any of the preclinical work that had been done or any of the earlier clinical work. The FDA put a clinical hold on that program, and in fact for every company that was doing a study with nerve growth factor, they brought together a collaboration of all of the companies and academic investigators who were doing work in this area to look at what caused this apparent increase in joint replacements, what was the diagnosis, what was the cause, and what other things were going on in the trial. What happened was they found that the risk was only high in patients who were taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the drugs that have been around for a long time, that are oftentimes used to treat osteoarthritis. If they were taking those in addition to the nerve growth inhibitors, then they had this unexpected side effect. What has occurred since then with this understanding is that the FDA lifted the clinical hold, but they put restrictions on the patients who could take the drug, or at least on other drugs that they could take at the same time in order to avoid this risk. Some companies have now dropped out, and I saw just last week that one of the big pharma companies that was doing a collaborative development program decided that they no longer wanted to prioritize this in comparison to other classes of drugs that they were developing. But as I understand it, there are other companies, including Pfizer, which was the leading company in this area and that was the first to discover the adverse effect, that have been allowed to go ahead. And for all the indications that I have is that Pfizer will be restarting their phase 3 program. But I think that when this drug gets approved, we will have a better understanding of risk factors, and there probably will be restrictions on who can take the drug, what other drugs they can take at the same time in order to provide the safety that we would want to have for a new class of drug.
So are you optimistic that the anti-NGF approach to pain relief will ultimately be successful? So I mean, do you think that one of these anti-NGF drugs will ultimately be approved?
I sure hope they will. And I say that not just because I'm an advocate for companies that are developing new pain medicines, because in truth, I'm an advocate for the patients who may not be able to take non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs because of other risk factors. Age is a risk factor for increasing GI bleeding, or if they've had previous ulcers, or if they have cardiovascular risk factors. An NSAID may not be an appropriate drug for those patients. And at this point, there would be limited other opportunities for them to get pain relief. They could use opioids, but there's been a lot of concern about the use of opioids for treating non-cancer pain. So for that class of patient, I think that an NGF inhibitor, particularly with its strong efficacy profile, might be a very good option. But this is still in the pre-approval stage. It has not been approved by the FDA. The FDA has not reviewed all of the evidence for safety and efficacy. So we'll all really have to wait to see, are there going to be further developments in this field, and will the FDA approve this?
Okay. Now, towards the end of the interview, we'll talk about some more compounds in development. But first, wanted to ask you about companies in terms of how they go about their work. So what are the key challenges that companies face now as they try to develop new pain relievers?
One of the big problems has been to identify targets that are useful for developing new classes of drugs. Targets means, is there a biological process that we can change that will induce pain relief? Is there something that's going on that is causing the pain that we can inhibit? The good news here is that there are a lot of new approaches that have been identified in the last 5 to 10 years, but most of that work has been taken on by smaller companies. And with smaller companies, what I mean is biotech companies that oftentimes may be started with 2 or 3 people. They may have some preclinical evidence that there may be an opportunity to inhibit an enzyme or a receptor in order to produce a good effect. In some cases, this work comes out of academia. And a professor may have studied a new compound in mice or in rats, and he feels or she feels that it's worthwhile taking it to the next step. Oftentimes they contact me at that stage because I can give them the advice in terms of what is necessary in order to show that the drug is safe enough and that it has the right pharmaceutical properties to take it into initial human clinical trials. I can then help them going forward, but the real limitation has been the source of capital, has been investment capital that's necessary to take it to the next step, or getting the attention of big pharma companies. And in most cases, the big pharma companies want to have clinical data before they're going to invest in a new pain drug. So helping companies to find that capital has been difficult. But this is where I can say the U.S. taxpayer has provided some support through the National Institutes of Health. Oftentimes, these smaller companies or academic laboratories can apply for NIH grants that will help to promote further development that'll take them farther along the development pathway. One of the companies that I'm working with just in the last month has qualified for a very new type of NIH grant called a Breakthrough Therapeutics Grant. And this allows them to take a product that has come out of an academic laboratory that has now been moved into a small company through advanced preclinical development and also into phase 1 clinical development, meaning the exposure of the drug for the first time to healthy volunteers to see whether it has the safety properties that we would like to advance it into pain patients later on. The NIH will provide all of the funding and advice to the company, with industry experts being part of the team that NIH has brought in, free of charge to the company. So this is something that is highly exciting. The company is working on a drug with a completely new mechanism of action, but at least the data that they had was strong enough to convince experts at the National Institutes of Health that this was something that would be sufficiently important that they wanted to make an investment to see that this would move to the next step.
Right. So you mentioned academia, small companies, larger, more established companies. So is the general idea that most of the innovation is coming from smaller companies or out of academia, and then these individuals will have to partner with the larger companies to get that capital, as you mentioned? Where's the innovation coming from?
Well, ultimately, the small companies do need to partner with bigger companies because the bigger companies have the resources, the capital, as well as the people and the skills that are necessary to take it through advanced clinical trials and through the process of getting the drug registered with the FDA. The Tufts Center for Drug Development has been tracking the cost of drug development for well over 20 years, probably longer than that. And I think their current estimate is that it costs $1.9 billion to develop a new drug. That's across all classes of drugs. And obviously small companies don't have access to that capital. Even big companies have begun to take a look at those numbers and say, what can we do to reduce the cost of drug development? So small companies have a role in oftentimes doing the innovation, but then they need to find big companies to help them take it to the next step. Where the big companies have been spending their money largely has been on biological compounds, the monoclonal antibodies, such as I'd mentioned with NGF inhibitors. That started with a small company, but then big companies took it on. Another major area that the big companies are focusing on right now are compounds that inhibit CGRP, which is kind of an acronym for another type of product, an endogenous chemical that may be involved in migraine. And there have been a lot of advances in developing a completely new class of migraine drug, but that requires the type of capital and the large-scale clinical trials that only big companies can take on.
So you mentioned the cost of clinical trials, and so we're talking billion, we're not talking even hundreds of millions, we're talking billions of dollars. Do you think those costs will come down in the future? And in terms of the length of time it takes to go from discovering a target in the lab, bringing it all the way through clinical trials, how long does that process take now, and do you think it will continue to be a very long process, or is there a way to streamline it?
In terms of how long it takes, the Tufts University studies have shown that on the average it takes about 8 years to develop a new drug. But they have also shown that neurological drugs, and that includes pain drugs, may take a little bit longer. So it might take 8 to 10 years. Now this is for a completely new class of drug, and the costs that they have talked about, $2.9 billion, would be for a completely new class of drug that affects a new enzyme or a new receptor in some way. Companies can still make innovations in this field in a much faster period of time and for much lower cost by reformulating some older drugs, and oftentimes taking drugs that have been approved for one use and investigating them for a different use. As an example, one of the projects that I've worked on in the last several years that is now in phase 3 clinical development is a topical formulation of a drug called clonidine. Clonidine is a drug that was developed originally for treating high blood pressure, and it's still used in some cases that way. It's also used in treating certain types of neurological diseases. It's also used as an adjunct to pain medicine, particularly in patients with postoperative pain or with cancer pain. But the limitation that we've had in the way that it has been used to treat pain in the past is that it lowers blood pressure. And in some cases, to get an effective dose, if it's administered systemically or taken orally, to get that dose that would potentiate the analgesic action of other drugs means that patients might have very low blood pressure, and that could be a significant risk for falls and for drowsiness and feeling poorly. So the company that I was working with, and that I still work with, developed a topical formulation of clonidine that could be put on the feet of patients with painful diabetic neuropathy. What we know about painful diabetic neuropathy is that it is a very severe type of pain. It's a pain that we call neuropathic pain. And it is generated by pain cells that are in the periphery, or pain fibers in the periphery. If we can cut off the abnormal firing pattern of those pain fibers, then we can produce an analgesic response. It's like closing the barn doors before the horse gets out. And in a way, that inherently is a very attractive way, because we then avoid a lot of potential systemic side effects. What we found in this particular case in phase 2 clinical trials was that very little of the drug was absorbed systemically. In fact, the vast majority, 90% of the patients, had no detectable clonidine in their blood, but the drug applied to their feet 3 times a day was able to control the pain from their disease, from painful diabetic neuropathy. That drug has now been licensed to another company, and it is in phase 3 clinical development. We'll have to see whether it really retains that profile of efficacy and safety moving forward. But I can tell you that the cost of developing that drug will be substantially less than the cost of developing an entirely new type of drug. It's an older drug. It's a drug that's been around for more than 50 years, but the innovator, in this case, a professor originally from Johns Hopkins University, a professor of neurosurgery, who did work in his academic laboratory, found that by reformulating an older product in a cost-effective way, he'd be able to move forward and show that this drug could be useful in treating a very severe type of pain.
Do you think there are lots and lots of old drugs that could be repurposed, and potentially even, drugs that people aren't even thinking of now?
Yeah, I think that is an opportunity, and fortunately we have a lot of smart people both in academia and in small companies around the world who are looking for those opportunities. I'd have to say, though, that there's probably been much more work in repackaging older drugs to make them abuse resistant. And that's important by itself, and the cost of doing that is substantially less than the cost of developing an entirely new drug. I'm sure that all of the listeners of this podcast are aware of the opioid problem that has not been with us just recently. It's been with us actually for many, many years. There has been abuse of extended release opioid products such as OxyContin and Opana. We've read about this even just in the last few days. But by making those drugs more difficult to crush, by making it more difficult to extract the active ingredients so that it could be snorted or it could be injected or taken inappropriately, for instance, all at once instead of using the drug's extended release profile the way that it's intended, it has caused some people to overdose, and would be remiss if we didn't use every effort that we could to prevent that from occurring. So there is new technology that has been approved by the FDA. Drugs have been reformulated to make them safer, and I think that this is an area where there still is a room for significant new innovation. And I know of two companies that, instead of taking a reformulation approach, have taken an approach to create prodrugs of existing opioids. Prodrugs meaning that drugs that by themselves are inactive, but when they are taken only by the appropriate route, but in this case being taken orally, they're then activated by enzymes in the digestive tract to release oxycodone or hydrocodone in these two cases that would produce the therapeutic effect. That is a safer way, I think, of limiting the ability of patients, not patients, but drug addicts to use products inappropriately. If those prodrug products were injected, they would not work. They would not be converted into the active drug. If they were snorted, again, they would not work. One of those drugs has now been approved, has been submitted to the FDA for drug approval. We'll have to see whether the FDA agrees with the company that has sponsored this work. It's a small company in the Midwest, and see whether that drug would be approved. Another company, one that I'm working with, is at an earlier stage of development, but they've already done pilot studies in humans to show that the technology works, and that with even a liquid formulation of this drug, we are able to get an extended release profile of oxycodone in the blood that would be equivalent to that of OxyContin, but in a way that would be much more difficult for patients to abuse.
In addition to making existing opioids harder to abuse, and in addition to the prodrug approach that you mentioned, are people interested? Do you think people will be able to develop brand new opioids that work differently than existing ones, that would provide pain relief but without the risk of abuse and misuse and addiction?
That's been an exciting area. In fact, that's what attracted me to this field professionally after I did my initial training in pharmacology. I had an opportunity to work for a company that was developing what at that time were called agonist-antagonist analgesics. Analgesics that worked the same as morphine-like drugs when they were administered for the treatment of post-operative pain. But if they were used in a different way, for instance, if they were used in conjunction with morphine, they could actually work as narcotic antagonists, and it was clearly shown that these drugs had a lower abuse liability and a better safety profile, less respiratory depression, and less gastrointestinal effects than typical opioid drugs. Several of those drugs did not progress as far as I would have liked, because while they worked if you injected them, if they were used in a hospital setting, they did not have very good oral bioavailability. So if you put them into a tablet formulation, they were not absorbed particularly well. But it gave us insights that there would be ways to work on different populations of opioid receptors in a selective way that would give them a better safety profile. So I know that there is one company that is developing a drug that works on the kappa opioid receptor instead of the mu opioid receptor. Morphine works on the mu opioid receptor. We know that drugs that are traditional mu agonists, and I use that term in an important way, traditional mu agonist compounds will produce analgesia. They will also potentially produce either euphoria or dysphoria, meaning patients either feel that they get a buzz from the drug, or that they feel that the drug is something that makes them feel terrible, maybe makes them feel drowsy, confused, and they can also cause constipation and respiratory depression and other adverse effects. So that's a traditional opioid profile. A kappa compound may be able to avoid some of those effects. And the company that I know of that is currently in phase 3 development has a peripherally restricted kappa compound. So that's an advance too. Prevent the drugs from getting into the brain where they could produce adverse effects on cognition or on euphoria or dysphoria or even respiratory depression. Keep them out of the brain, but make them available to work on peripheral opioid receptors to produce their analgesic response. The phase 2 data for that particular compound have been very promising. We'll have to see if it gets any further. There's another company that I'm working with that has been looking at the mu-opioid receptor, but they've looked beyond the receptor itself at signal transduction pathways. What happens after a drug binds to a receptor? There are other endogenous chemicals that are released in ways that then affect biological processes, and they found that they could fine-tune their drug by chemical modification so that it only activated G proteins and not a class of compounds or class of signal transduction pathways called beta-arrestin. And by doing that, they've shown that their drug, which is also now in phase 3 clinical development, produces less respiratory depression, has faster onset of analgesia, potentially even greater analgesia for postoperative pain. And that could be a significant advance going forward. It could be a safer type of mu agonist compound, maybe even with less dependence liability, less abuse liability than what we have with morphine. So we have had advances with opioids in very different ways than what we've had in the past. We've had also advances in non-opioid compounds. And Neil, if this is the right time to talk about it, we talked a little bit about NGF inhibitors. I mentioned CGRP inhibitors. I'm also really excited about companies that are developing non-opioid and non-NSAID compounds for the future.
Yeah, well, that's actually a great transition to the last part of our interview here and looking at the future. So are there any particular compounds, I mean, you've mentioned some, but are there any other particular compounds under development that seem especially promising to you?
There are. And it's interesting that last fall I was contacted by an editor, actually a writer, for a journal called P&T, which I think stands for Pharmacy and Therapeutics. And the writer had been asked by her editor to write a contemporary article on what's new in the pain development field, in the development of analgesic compounds. And when she called me, she said that she had the impression that there hadn't been very much innovation in this area. And I said, whoa, let's take a step back. I'm going to put together a chart and send it to you, and we're going to take a look at it. And what I sent her in November was a list of more than 50 drugs that are in phase 1, 2, or 3 clinical development or have just very recently been approved for pain indications. And a number of these work in very different ways than drugs in the past. One of the innovations has been in finding compounds that may inhibit sodium channels or that may inhibit calcium channels, both of which we know are involved in neuronal excitability, in the ability of nerve cells to fire and to communicate with each other. When that communication goes awry, when the nerve cells are firing in an aberrant fashion, either firing too often or firing where there is no reasonable cause for pain to exist, then that's something that we generally would call neuropathic pain. I think that, to put this in context, we've had sodium channel inhibitors for a long time. Lidocaine or xylocaine, local anesthetics are sodium channel inhibitors, but they're not highly selective inhibitors, and where we've been able to go based upon advances in biology and understanding the confirmation of the channel that is involved in inhibiting pain responses versus other side effects that could be caused, we've found a way to develop potential pain drugs, pain inhibiting compounds that affect only one class of sodium channel or only one class of calcium channel. That's exciting, but there are challenges too, in that the first generation of these compounds were not very water soluble. It was very difficult to formulate them in a way that they could be used successfully or where they would have good oral bioavailability. I think there have been some advances there. I'm certainly optimistic about some new advances with sodium and calcium channel inhibitors. There are a number of other biological targets that are becoming increasingly important. But I want to tell you about one other project that I've had the chance to work on that really caught me by surprise. And I've worked in this area for all of my professional career. But 3 years ago, I was contacted by an academic lab, one that was at UC Davis, and they said that they had a potential new pain compound and they were looking for an expert who could help to guide them. And I asked them to come on over and show me what they had, and I kind of expected that what they would have would be a couple of mice, a couple of rats, and maybe they had some new idea and it was going to take a long, long time to move any farther. But I was astounded by what they had done. And I was astounded because, for one, I was unfamiliar with the target that they had been working on, and number two, they came out of a department at the university that would not normally be associated with creating new pain compounds. The major professor is a professor of entomology. He's a bug doctor. He had been working on compounds that would inhibit the way that bugs mature, or that could be used as inhibitors to protect crops. And in fact, he had discovered an enzyme more than 30 years ago when he was trying to find out how caterpillars metamorphosize or transition into butterflies. What allowed a caterpillar to become this beautiful butterfly? It turns out it's just one enzyme. And when he began to look where else that enzyme existed, he then found it in mice and in rats and in humans, but also in potatoes and tomatoes and in all sorts of other plants and animals. And then he began to develop inhibitors for this enzyme. What happened if you turn the enzyme off? What does this enzyme do biologically? It took a long time. It took a lot of NIH support over a period of 30 years, but by the time that he contacted me, he had discovered a compound that could be used in treating pain in a way that was very novel and unexpected from my perspective, but that could have significant advantages over other classes of drugs. And at the end of the day, I said, Bruce, this is so exciting. I will work for you free of charge until we get this company financed. I mean, it's that important to me, because he not only had studies in mice and in rats, but he had synthesized over 3,000 compounds. He had optimized them for binding to the human enzyme. He had then done studies in dogs and in cats, as well as studies on in vitro preparations, cells from humans, to show that it would work on the human receptor that was of interest. It's actually an enzyme. And not only dogs and cats, but also on horses with a very severe type of neuropathic pain, inflammatory pain and neuropathic pain that had been unresponsive to any other class of drugs at an advanced veterinary medical center. And when you show me that animals have failed to respond to traditional drugs, and then suddenly when they're injected with a new compound and they've been taken from a position where they were literally on death's door to then being mobile, eating, moving normally, and apparently pain-free within a period of less than 24 hours, that's something that I find extraordinary. And they showed me one horse that had been treated. It was a thoroughbred horse, so a valuable horse in that respect, with a condition called equine laminitis. I was somewhat familiar with that. I don't know as much about veterinary medicine as I know about human medicine, but what I do know is that in veterinary medicine, there are even more limited opportunities to produce good pain relief than there are in humans. For instance, we would not want to give aspirin or ibuprofen to a dog or to a cat for more than a few days at a time, because they are far more susceptible to gastrointestinal bleeding than humans are. So the opportunity to potentially develop a new class of drugs for treating companion animals as well as treating humans was very attractive to me. And that's in fact the same compound that now has gone into this NIH Blueprint Therapeutics network, where the NIH is so excited about this program that they are willing to provide taxpayer dollars to make certain that this goes into initial phase 1 clinical trials. And once we have tested the compound for safety in normal healthy volunteers, then we'll be able to move into pain patients. But this company now, which has been spun out of UC Davis, will also simultaneously be developing a compound for treating companion animals. So that's where I really get excited.
Yeah. Are there particular chronic pain conditions when you're looking at all of these exciting drugs and compounds in development? Are there particular chronic pain conditions for which you think these new drugs in development will have the best chance to be effective?
In the area of chronic pain, there are many types of chronic pain, and we can make a basic division between chronic non-cancer pain and chronic cancer pain. And sometimes the compounds that we use to treat these are a little bit different in both cases, but in other cases they're very much the same. For patients who have chronic cancer pain, I know how severe that can be. And that's actually the area where I got excited about the NGF inhibitors more than 10 or 12 years ago when I saw some of the very early preclinical studies at a conference in Vancouver. And what I saw there was a new biology of understanding how cancer pain occurs in bones in particular, and how an NGF inhibitor had remarkable efficacy in treating cancer pain, bone cancer pain in animals. I'm hoping that that's one of the areas, one of the additional areas for the NGF inhibitors in the future that's going to show some promise. But the big areas for treating chronic pain, based on the number of patients who are affected, would be osteoarthritis, where the typical drugs that we use today are the aspirin-like drugs. And the second biggest class of chronic pain is a neuropathic pain condition that I'd already touched on a little bit called painful diabetic neuropathy. So in most cases, we are developing drugs that will flow eventually into those particular populations. But that's not to forget about, well, we have spinal cord injury pain, and we have pain from neurological diseases such as multiple sclerosis. So in each of these cases where there are opportunities, I encourage companies to move forward. I just actually got a call 2 days ago from a company that was interested in treating visceral pain. They had a new concept in treating visceral pain. And I said, you know, I've been talking to companies for more than 20 years about the need to develop better drugs for treating visceral pain. What does this mean? Well, I think that everybody's familiar with kidney stones, gallstones. Maybe you're familiar with interstitial cystitis. Maybe you're familiar with other more rare types of visceral pain, such as vulvodynia. These, for the patients who have those types of pain, are very disabling. And it affects their quality of life, it affects their ability to work, it affects their ability to have normal relations with other family members. Finding drugs to treat those smaller groups of pain are just as important to me as finding drugs that would be able to treat osteoarthritis or painful diabetic neuropathy. So where I find opportunities and I can get the key to fit in the lock in the correct way and get companies enthused, that's where I try to help them to the next step.
Bill, this has been a fantastic discussion, and your optimism about the future of drug development is just shining through, which I think will be very, very comforting and exciting to patients and others who are listening to this podcast. Do you care to make a prediction in terms of when some of these drugs might make it to the market? And if it's hard to sort of pinpoint a specific time, are we talking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Can you give a general sort of time frame?
With the number of drugs that are currently in phase 3, which is the last stage of development before a new drug application is filed with the FDA, I would anticipate that some of those drugs will be approved in the next 5 years. Typically, phase 2 clinical trials take about 2 years, and then it takes about a year to go through the process of putting together the NDA, the new drug application, filing it with the FDA, and then hopefully getting a drug approval. In reality, only about 50% of drugs make it through phase 3 to NDA approval. So not all of these drugs are necessarily going to get approved for a variety of reasons. But what we haven't touched on, and I think it's really important for me to say this now, is that the FDA has also been very cooperative with companies developing new classes of drugs, and there are new pathways that speed up the FDA development process. New data has shown that it's actually faster to get a drug approval in the United States than in Europe or virtually any other part of the world. And part of this is because of laws that Congress passed some number of years ago that require the FDA to either approve or reject a drug within 9 months after the drug application has been filed. It doesn't happen all the time, but the FDA has actually been pretty good about keeping to that. But where there are drugs that fit into a breakthrough status or that work differently or that are life-saving drugs, then they can put it on a priority review, and that reduces the amount of time to 6 months that they have to review an application and potentially get a new drug out on the market. So in the next 5 years, Neil, we will have new drugs that work through new mechanisms of action, and in the next 10 years, I'm hoping that we're going to have a broadly new pharmacotherapy for the treatment of pain. This is where I got into the field long ago because I wanted to reinvent the way that we practice pain medicine. I knew even when I was 5 years old, as an active child who had many trips to the emergency room, that physicians oftentimes didn't have the best training in treating acute and chronic pain, and they certainly didn't have the right tools. And I decided at that time I wanted to be part of the solution and help develop new classes of drugs.
Wow, so that is very exciting and just a tremendous amount to look forward to. So, Bill, thank you so much thank you for taking the time to talk to Relief. It's really been fascinating to hear your perspective from really the frontiers of pain drug development. And as we mentioned, as you really emphasized, tremendous reason for optimism, and I think people who are listening to the podcast should have reasons to be encouraged. So thank you again so much. It's been fascinating.
Neil, it's my pleasure.